this, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms, leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms, leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how sweet to walk in this pilgrim way, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms, leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms, leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. I have blessed peace with my Lord so near. Leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms.
I'm Nathan Mugas, pastor at Elk River Lutheran Church.
I'm Lisa Sampson, Director of Children, Youth, and Family Ministry.
Jeremy Hulkus, Minister of Congregational Care and Discipleship.
And I'm Taylor Quinn, the Director of Music and Worship.
And we are glad to have you joining us for another episode of Sacred Wit and our ERLC Powered by Love podcast. It's great to have you here as we continue our David series. David, almost perfect, but not quite. So we enter into another story of David tonight.
Today we're talking about David and Goliath. Probably a familiar text to most people if you ever went to Sunday school. Big Goliath and little David, and David slew him with a stone, and it's a big deal story. So I'm curious, what has your experience been with these stories? I mean, I think we all heard them in Sunday school. What do you think of David and Goliath now?
I grew up with the 1960s or 70s Davy and Goliath claymation version of this, which is the boy and his dog that go and tackle the world. And the church that I grew up in still played them on the old VHS. I mean, it was very antiquated. So I've had the sanitized version of David and Goliath.
I don't remember nothing comes to mind with David and Goliath. But what does come to mind is Noah and the flood, and my Sunday school teacher used
Flannel graph technology.
flannel graphing.
Yeah.
So that's all I remember. I don't remember much about David and Goliath.
I mean, it's one of those stories that, I remember vividly. I remember vividly a different version of VHS telling of it, I just still remember the lighting and the images of this little boy, and it kind of moved in a funny way. And I remember, him getting the sling and whipping it around and it hit Goliath, and thinking, man, I wish I had a sling like that. Out on the farm, I could have really went after some birds or something. I don't know what I would have done. My brother, I don't know. And so it's probably good that I didn't have one. But it is funny to think about now. I mean, this is a story about someone killing someone else. It's funny that I learned that in Sunday school as this yes, David got him. When really, it's war and stuff. But it's interesting for me to think about now as an adult and a pastor and a parent that this is a great story we teach kids about how you better kill the big guy who's trying to get you before he gets you.
I've never looked too much into David and Goliath except for in my teaching of children. But the one thing that reminded me of Goliath was when I first saw Hagrid on film. Mm-hmm. Not when I read the books, but when I went to the theater and I saw Hagrid, I went, well, that's Goliath.
It's a giant.
Harry Potter.
It's a giant, yeah.
He's a half giant, technically.
Yes, technically.
But,
technically.
but,
oh gosh, Potter nerds.
Big guy.
Yeah. Well, we're going to read the story for you in our Reader's Theater style. So, Taylor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to ERLC Reader's Theater. Today we'll be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 32 through 49.
In the great valley of Elah, 2 armies gathered for battle. God's chosen people, the Israelites with their king Saul, were on one side of the mountain, and their enemies, the Philistines, were on the other side. From the camp of the Philistines came a giant of a man named Goliath of Gath. He was ginormous. He was 9 feet and 9 inches tall, and his coat weighed over 90 pounds, and his spear was 15 pounds. Goliath roared his challenge to the Israelite camp.
Are you not here for a battle? Choose your best and send him to fight me. If he wins, we will be your servants, but if I win, which I will, you will be our servants.
King Saul and his leaders were afraid. They knew they could not win against the mighty giant Goliath. For 40 days, Goliath came forward and took his stand and made his challenge. For 40 days, nothing happened. While this was going on, a young man named David was tending his father's sheep and running errands for his father. One day, his father Jesse summoned David.
My son, bring this bread and cheese to your brothers and the others on the mountainside opposite the Philistines and the frightful Goliath. Make sure King Saul also receives some of this too.
When David found his brothers, he heard the Philistine champion, giant Goliath, bellow.
Send your best men to fight me.
David turned to King Saul and said,
God protects me from wolves and bears while I protect my father's sheep. He will protect me now, too.
David reached down and carefully chose 5 smooth stones, which he carried in his pouch. In his hand he carried his sling, and he walked down the mountainside into the valley of Elah to meet Goliath. Goliath laughed when he saw young David coming toward him. In fact, he roared with laughter and said,
You are the warrior they sent to fight me?
David slipped a stone into his sling and said to Goliath,
I am not afraid of you, Goliath of Gath. I fight in the name of the Lord.
David moved closer to the giant, swinging his sling. The smooth stone flew through the air and hit Goliath in the forehead. All 9 feet and 9 inches of the giant fell down to earth with a thud that could be felt all down the valley. When the Philistines saw that young David had defeated their giant warrior, they turned and ran away. King Saul, David's brothers, and the rest of the Israelites gave a cheer and thanks to God for saving them from their enemy with just a sling and a stone.
Here ends ERLC Reader's Theater.
So that's the story we've all heard and we grew up hearing. And but I think there's a lot more to this story, so I think we're going to dig into that tonight and see what else there is. What else is going on?
I have a question. I know the term Philistines. They're a band in Kansas City.
Sure.
But I'm
Check my
not
study
quite
Bible.
Page
But I'm curious, what are the Philistines in this story?
Yeah. And so there's an interesting answer to this. So let's give some context to it. If we can go back to the actual text, this Reader's Theater is a little adaptation. So if you're following along in your Bible, you'll notice there were a few words kind of added to either spice it up or shorten it a little bit because it is a long text. And so, Lisa, do you want to read a couple verses about the Philistines, and then we'll talk about who are the Philistines?
Sure. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Succoth and Azekah and the Ephes Dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them.
Yeah, well, very well done reading all those crazy, goofy names about these
And
locations.
they were all correct.
You said them all perfectly. Should we drag Taylor a little bit about the way he keeps mispronouncing Philistines
No,
when we
'cause
were
that'll-
practicing?
Philistines.
How did we tell you to remember it, Taylor?
Christine.
Yes.
So if I slip into Christine while reading the next stuff.
then you
you'll
know
know
why.
why.
Why is Taylor talking about Christines
Christine.
and the Christine army? Well, so the Philistines in this story, as we've already heard a couple times now, they're the enemy that Saul's army, the people of Israel, are fighting against. They're the enemy. And that's actually the role they play pretty much throughout the Bible. Every time the Philistines show up, for the most part, it's as an adversary. And I think what I think is really interesting is biblical scholars actually disagree about who the Philistines were. For the most part, a lot of them believe that the Philistines weren't actually a set nation of people, but in fact that the writers of the Bible actually just used that term Philistine as kind of a generic term for anyone that the people of Israel were doing battle against. So I mean, isn't that kind of interesting that maybe maybe it was this nation of people or this nation of people, but they just get called the Philistines. And so that's why all throughout the Bible it kind of seems like they're always doing battle with the Philistines, because they kind of are. Like, it's kind of the Philistines. From right back to when Moses leads the people of Israel right up to the promised land, and then they head in, it's the Philistines who are there. And
Because
so,
I've heard the Philistines in different parts of different stories, I believe.
yes, indeed. And so let me share a few examples. One, early on in the book of Judges, chapter 13, we hear stories of the Philistines fighting with the people of Israel. And the people of Israel, they have a great hero named Samson. And so if you remember the escapades of the great hero Samson, those come from mostly the book of Judges. And they're fighting the Philistines. And so a couple trivia questions for Samson, okay? So all of you, see if you know the answers to these questions. What was it that gave Samson, the hero, his kind of superhero strength? He was like more powerful and strong than a normal person ever should be. And what was it that gave him his superhero strength? Do you know it? If you know it, shout it out, comment on it, whatever. How about you all? What was it?
It's a thing I wish I had.
Yes. Oh, his faux hawk. Yeah, exactly. His hair. And if you know the story, then later this lady named Delilah will cut his hair, and all of a sudden he's just a normal strong guy, not the superhero strong guy. So, and when in that story, when he's fighting the Philistines, Samson uses an unlikely weapon. So here's trivia question number 2, our last trivia question for Samson. What was the weapon that he used? Do you know? When he's fighting the Philistines, it wasn't a sword. It wasn't a spear. It wasn't even a slingshot. It was something really weird.
I know.
Yeah.
It was the jawbone of an ass. Because
Yes.
that's such a scary thing.
Yes, exactly. The jawbone of an ass or a donkey. And so, like, that is a crazy thing to picture, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure that's a hard thing that I wouldn't want to get hit with. But if you ever look up art, famous paintings of, like even old, of Samson wielding the jawbone, I mean, it's funny because it's small. Like, relative to a really big muscular guy, it's kind of a funny little weapon.
The images are always, the jawbone looks part dinosaur rather
I
than
was saying
Yeah.
a T-Rex
They
might
gotta
make
kind of
sense.
spice it
this
up a little
massive
bit.
thing.
Yeah, because in reality, a jawbone's not that big. But that's what the story goes. That's what Samson did. Well, the Philistines show up much earlier in the book of 1 Samuel as well, including, they're fighting against Saul, and they actually capture the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, you may remember from earlier times in the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant was that ornate box that was built to hold the 10 Commandments. So the people of Israel, even as they were wandering, had this ark that carried the 10 Commandments. It was a focus of worship and really key to their identity as a people. And the Philistines stole it. You may also remember another time in history when the Nazis captured the Ark of the Covenant in the early 20th century, and an American archaeologist had to recapture it. His name was Indiana Jones. And so if you remember, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that was just a movie. It wasn't real. Or was it? We don't
Or was
know.
it? Yeah.
Maybe it was a documentary. I don't know. But entertaining story. And finally, then, as we could go on and on with these examples of the Philistines fighting people, but if you fast forward to near the end of the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 31 is where the Philistines will actually defeat and kill King Saul. He ends up meeting his demise at the hands of the Philistines. So in these David stories, the Philistines play a big role, but really you'll find them all throughout the Bible. And to go back to the very first thing, a part of the reason is we kind of believe that might have been a term not just for one specific real difficult group of people that they always butted heads with, but that was kind of this term used for who they were fighting in general, right up to the end of Saul's experience. So.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting too. The hero Goliath comes out of that. This sort of hero champion of the people ultimately comes out of that text. And we have, if you're following along, for Samuel 17, 4-11, we'll do a little bit of digging into who this character really is. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits. How tall is a cubit? And a span. About that tall, right. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. Anybody know what that is?
Yes.
Thick, yes. Right. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. This is big. Think big, big, big. And his shield bearer went before him, so somebody who carried a shield. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And so there are all these kind of crazy theories about, did Goliath exist? Because everything he had was in bronze, is he part of the Bronze Age? And you can really get lost in the weeds or History Channel on, figuring out who this person is or where, things might exist for him. But we're kind of going to pull back a little bit from that and kind of focus a little more on some nuances that hold some truth. So Goliath, it's important to know, Goliath is the champion. He's well loved. He's probably the great hero of the Philistine army. And so the Philistines put their faith in Goliath's abilities. And if you catch in the text the kind of interesting parts, Goliath is the one they choose to either win or lose the battle for the entire army. And so think, if you're like literature, think Homer's Odyssey, right? Paris and Menelaus in the Battle of Troy. You can think Achilles, this great hero, or even Ajax, so kind of Greek mythology kind of falls into this category. So it's not uncommon that Goliath really would have been in this position to do these things. And it's kind of fascinating to think about Goliath being for the people he's with, calling out Israel in so many ways, saying, hey, send me the person that I'm going to defeat so you can just be our servants. So it had me kind of thinking about the Goliaths in our own stories and the Goliaths we see kind of overcoming or we see experiencing as we move forward in life. So tell me a little about your Goliaths. And if you're watching, this is a great question for you guys too.
And you mean Goliaths, not the heroes of our lives, but like
that thing that
obstacles?
stands in opposition to us.
Yeah. One example that I've shared before at different times in different contexts, I think, is in 2011, Annie and I lived in Minot, and our house flooded. And, I think back to that time, and initially we didn't even know how big of a Goliath it was because, the river was getting high, so we had to evacuate for probably a few days until it went back down. And so, we went and stayed with a friend of mine's parents, and we thought, okay, this will just be a few days turned into a few weeks, and then the river really flooded, and that turned into months. And we stayed with them for 4 months and ended up being out of our house for 18 months before we were finally rebuild it and move back in. And so, that was a huge Goliath kind of challenge in our lives. But then because of, the situation of it being a flood of our city, like lots of other people were facing that same challenge. And, so in hindsight, I look back at it as, we didn't conquer it alone in any sense, but it's very good to look at that as a memory and to not versus going through it. In the time it was terrible and it was hard, it was scary, and it was just uncertain. And I've thought about that a lot recently because it feels so similar to this pandemic experience, even down to, early on, like that first week when things started and we canceled church that weekend in March thinking, oh gosh, this will probably be a couple weeks. We were order some hand sanitizer and get ready to when we come back. And, weeks turned into months, turned into, we're still not sure now. Like this has gone on longer, I think, than any of us would have guessed back in March, right? And so this is this like Goliath-sized challenge that not just part of the city of Minot is facing, but it's the whole world is facing this Goliath together. And, eventually we'll be looking back on it and having conquered this, but man, when you're in the fight, it's a fight, and it feels like a fight these days a lot of times.
Absolutely. It's been such a long Goliath to deal with.
Yeah.
And and you want it to just stop fighting it, but we have to keep going.
Yeah, keep looking
until
for that,
it's done.
Yeah, that one stone that this will be the one that gets it and knocks it down. And the vaccine's probably that shot that could come eventually. But until then, we got to learn to live with this thing for a while.
I was thinking of it too, like my greatest fear, and I hate sharing it, but it is. My greatest fear is public speaking.
Sure.
And so I always
You picked a weird job, dude.
I picked the wrong place to be. But I always I have to live into that moment of the fear, especially in church, walking from the chair we sit in up to the pulpit. I'm shaking so bad it's ridiculous until I get there and go, okay, God's got this. Something else is better. And so having to literally conquer this thing within myself every time I go to public speak, it's just this kind of challenge for me of gotta trust that something's better on the other side.
I think my Goliath was when I was younger. It was with my identity. I'm adopted, and my parents love me. They were great parents, but I just never quite fit in, and I didn't know who I was, especially when you're doing those social studies projects where you trace your family. Both my parents have huge genealogy on both sides already done for me. I'd come in with a great poster with the longest thing back to 1700 in Norway. It was great, but they weren't my people.
Sure.
And so I still don't know a whole lot about who my birth parents were, but what changed for me was when I had my own children. Because then I realized that now I had a family, even though they, it gets, those of you that are adopted probably understand this more, but that's what overcame it for me, is that I realized that we choose our family, our friends are our family, and my children made a huge difference for me with that.
I'm thinking about my Goliaths that I overcame. There are Goliaths still that I deal with now. Sometimes my personality kind of gets in the way of me. But I've realized it's been emotional giants that I've gotten past, and for me, it's been my resentments. Just growing up, I think whatever family you're in, you develop these resentments towards people. And my Goliaths that I have overcome is when I faced those resentments, did something about it, and they no longer have a hold on me. So I love this idea of reflecting on what have my Goliaths been and what has been overcome, permanently. But we also have those moments where our giants come and go,
Well, it's interesting, like as a society in a world, we're still talking about giants. Black Lives Matter, right? These are things that are out there that people are wrestling with to try to find some resolution to. And I think they come up against it and they're hearing that taunting and they're trying to figure out, what do I do with this? And I think as we sort of, as a collective whole, begin to understand what God is doing, what community is doing, what people are doing, we ultimately start to discover that those giants aren't so scary after all. And I think, we're kind of heading into this piece of this great, wonderful song, We Shall Overcome, which is this march and this challenge to think about. But our giants still exist. We're still facing these things every day.
Well, personally, some of those are inside of us. Like the other time about your own feelings that only you can see and even fully experience, and yet then there's all these external giants. Absolutely.
Right.
And we have a song to kind of help you through that. So Jeremy was talking about the giants that we face, and sometimes we don't see the end, and music helps us get through it. And so if you know the song We Shall Overcome, will you sing it with me? We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in our hearts, we do believe we shall overcome someday.
Well, we're going to move towards thinking a little bit about David. Getting to the big guy himself here. The big
The
little
little guy.
guy.
Big little guy, yeah.
Exactly. And one of the things that's, I think, most interesting about this story in the broader context is what we really see in this story is the beginning of Saul's decline right along with the beginning of David's ascendancy. And part of my thinking about this is, once again, like I'll look for any excuse I can to talk about the Hamilton musical. And so I will use this as an opportunity to do that because I think there's some parallels. If you know this musical, Hamilton, it really focuses largely about telling the story of Alexander Hamilton and in this unlikely rise to power and prominence. You wouldn't have expected that from his background. It makes him a super interesting character and a great focus of that story. Well, David, likewise, at this point in his story, he's still this young man. He has been anointed, chosen to be the next king, but no one except for his family and Samuel, the prophet who chose him, really know anything about that. And so he's living still in kind of obscurity, bringing cheeses to his his brothers who are at the battle. And so he's kind of in the background. And yet, then as he is there in this story, he takes center stage. While Saul, we start to see his decline as the young, scrappy David's fame starts to grow, especially after he kills this giant. And so Lin-Manuel Miranda, the writer of the musical, he really lays out Alexander Hamilton's rise in song number 3 on the track. It's number 3, My Shot. And so I'm going to share a little bit of this with you, and you all can help me with the shots,
Awesome.
if you will. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Awesome.
Hear these words and think about, like, okay, this is talking about Alexander Hamilton in the 1700s, but how does it think about David in the BC years, quite a few years earlier? Okay, so here's how it goes. It goes, I'm not throwing away my
Shot.
No, I'm not throwing away my
Shot.
Hey, yo, I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my
Shot.
I'm going to get a scholarship to King's College. I probably shouldn't brag, but dang, I amaze and astonish. The problem is I got a lot of brains, but no polish. I got to holler just to be heard with every word I drop knowledge. I'm a diamond in the rough, a shiny piece of coal, trying to reach my goal. Power of speech, unimpeachable, only 19, but my mind is older. These New York City streets get colder. I shoulder every burden, every disadvantage I I have learned to manage. I don't have a gun to brandish. I walk the streets famished. The plan is to fan my spark into a flame, but dang, it's getting colder. Let me spell out my name. I am the ALEXANDER. We are meant to be and this is where it talks about the British colony. It's not as reflective, so we'll skip that part. But he goes then, don't be shocked when your history book mentions me. I will lay down my life if it sets us free. Eventually, you'll see my ascendancy. I am not throwing away my
shot.
I am not throwing away my
shot.
Hey, yo, I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my
Shot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, that.
All right, when's your record deal coming out?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay.
Harmonica, I mean the tin sandwich,
The many,
Yeah.
many talents that
rapping.
pre-COVID we
So
didn't know.
thank you to my mom and dad for letting me buy that Vanilla Ice tape back in the early 90s. It's really helped me develop these skills over the years. Yeah, well, so it is kind of funny. So y'all can find that song and find Lynn doing a much better job rapping it than me. But we all here have the words in front of us, which is helpful because I said them kind of fast. Lynn says them really fast in the album. But if you listen to those, you might see, I think there are quite a few parallels in this with the David story. And so especially you guys with the advantage of having the words in front of you, you all, if you look them up online, you can find them. But I want to see, what parallels do you all see in this, the way Lin-Manuel Miranda is telling Alexander Hamilton's story and his ascendancy, and the way we hear and see David's ascendancy in this story and others?
I think in 1 Samuel 48, David actually spells out his name.
Yeah.
I am the D-A-V-I-D.
Yeah, it's,
So there's a similarity.
it's very dramatic. It's good.
Well, what I pulled out of there, I didn't find that part in my
Yeah.
Bible.
Yeah.
But where it says that he shouldn't brag, but dang, I amaze and astonish.
Yeah.
Back when we talked about how God doesn't look at the outside appearance, but then right away when they go to describe David, they're saying, oh, and he was so ruddy and handsome and had beautiful eyes.
Right.
He amazed
But
and
dang,
astonished.
yeah.
God, but dang, he was a good-looking guy.
Yeah.
And he has a lot of brains and no polish. He's young. You know, he's a leader. He's doing all those things, but he just doesn't have it together yet.
He literally doesn't have armor, so he's not shining, right?
No.
Yeah, he doesn't-
Right. I love this. I'm only 19, but my mind is older. Like, think of a kid jumping into the fray.
Yeah.
I mean, David's already sort of gotten into Saul's court and playing music and all of these things. Like, he's got to be smart to do this.
Yeah.
And just, being a young one, like, stepping into that role. That's amazing.
Yeah, and that's, we have no reason to believe that David wrote all the Psalms at the end of his life when he was old.
Right.
Like, we talked about Psalms last week, and that's, likely he was an old, wise soul. Like, this was this giftedness that he had going back, from youth, and
Right.
and so, yeah, I think that's, very, very good parallel.
And he didn't have a gun to brandish. So he didn't have the chainmail and the sword and stuff. He
Yeah.
used what he had, which was his wits.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, too, even just that chorus line, I'm not throwing away my shot. He's there on the battlefield. So are hundreds and maybe thousands of other people who could have stepped up to, offer to fight Goliath at any time. And yet David's the one who sees that opportunity. He just is bringing lunch to his brothers, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, actually, yeah, I'll take the shot. I'll do this, and I mean, yeah, he's not throwing away his shot. He's just young, scrappy, and hungry. He's not throwing away his shot.
His brothers were
His
hungry.
brothers are hungry.
Yeah.
That's why he brought
He's
the
young and
cheese.
scrappy.
He brought the lunch. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm young and scrappy.
Yeah.
My brothers are hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gosh.
Always to Hamilton, which is awesome. In fact, I'm gonna take it one step further here as we're kind of thinking about our next step. There's this great line in there. The problem is I got a lot of brains but no polish. I gotta holler just to be heard. With every word, I drop knowledge. Like, we catch this David moving forward in the story. David is ultimately asked to do a little bit of errand running for Jesse. Bring this meal to them. And so we'll read 1 Samuel 17 to 19. Jesse said to his son David, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers face, and bring some token for them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David is the errand boy, basically. He's running between the sheep in the field to the battlefield. My guess is, in this story, it's not the first time David's done this.
Yeah.
And so we catch this, like, the younger brother being tasked with the chores. I mean, we do this with our own kids, too. So, Clayton gets to go grab things all the time from mom and dad. It's kind of part of the process. But it's also fun, like, David would have heard these taunts from Goliath. He'd been there, I'm guessing, a few times. David had come out Goliath had come out for 40 days and taunted at the Israelites. And every time that he did, the Israelite army would cower in fear and run away. And I'm guessing, reading into the story a little bit, David probably just got sick of it. I mean, I think that he would have said, I don't like this guy. Why does he do this? And so David runs into the lines where his brothers are, into the field of battle. And he starts asking these questions about, what will we get if we take care of this disgusting person, Goliath? I mean, there's just kind of this, character thing of David to just keep asking. And he gets louder and louder and he keeps asking these questions. And of course, being the younger brother, the older brother does what happens. They get mad at each other, right? His brother basically says, "Quit doing this, get out of here." Yeah. And so David keeps pestering the soldiers around his brother and keeps asking. And ultimately what happens is the word gets around the troops. And then the word ultimately gets up to Saul, who says, "Well, send him over here." Yeah. It's just kind of this interesting exchange that this little kid on the battlefield, in and amongst the troops, ultimately is summoned to the king. Yeah. And before Saul can say a word, David is already saying, "Oh, I'll take care of this guy. Your servant will take care of it. Don't lose heart, man." I think there's something powerful about David's presence. One thing to note in the text, if you're following along, if you have followed the Old Testament, and especially this story, all along the way, God's voice is heard. So God says to Samuel, this is the king, right? And God actually speaks in the text. From a literary standpoint, the David and Goliath story, God's voice is silent. There's no, "Oh, David, you can defeat this Goliath, go do it." God isn't there in that same sense. So it's always kind of curious, if you think about that sense, like God isn't directing David's path directly, that there's something else going on. So what would this tell you guys about David's experience with God?
David is known as the man after God's own heart. Like you hear that often about David, and what I'm thinking of is, isn't it just great when someone does something you don't ask him to do it? And I think that's what happened. I think that's actually I love that you said that, because that really it speaks volumes. It becomes profound.
Right. Yeah.
Wait, God didn't say anything? David, on his own, decided to do this because of his faith and what he believed.
Yeah.
I think I see David as a leader, that he just jumped right in there, just like all of us have done it one time or another. I'll just do it myself. You people have been standing around here for 40 days. 40 is an important number in the Bible.
Yeah.
We have to end it today, so I'm just going to do it.
Right. It's the 41st day.
Yeah.
I'm going.
Yeah, we can't go to 41.
That would be weird. Yeah. Well, yeah. Because on the surface, it's like David is either really, cocky, arrogant, too self-assured, or he's deeply faithful,
Right.
and trusting that God will carry him through. But I think there's room that maybe it's a little bit of both. Right? I think there's something to David's character, it would seem, that gives him a self-confidence and a trust in both God and himself.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because this is a big, bold thing, and he'll do a lot of bold things in his life, and this is the one that makes him famous for sure.
Right. So can I pitch a movie? Have you seen the movie Big Fish?
Yes.
Years ago, but I remember
Okay.
loving it.
So the story is this young kid goes into the witch's house, and if you see the witch's eye, ultimately you'll know how you'll die. I mean, it's this great image right off the bat. And so Edward Bloom is his name, but he spends the rest of his life going, that's not how I'll die. I can do anything. I mean, is this just great connection to this this ability to know where you're going? And I wonder if, David is anointed in secret. David has already been told that God is with him and he is to be king.
Yeah.
Well, he can do anything. I mean, this guy can accomplish it all. So,
He already experienced God, and wow.
kind of an interesting moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that errs more on the side of faith, still a little reckless.
Right.
But, if God's truly faithful to him, like God said God would be, well then, why? Sure, fight a giant.
Right. Do it because I am with you, even if I don't have to tell you directly. I love that sense of maybe there's something about the way David just charges in.
Yeah.
I think it is an example of when we know ourselves well enough to have confidence in who we are, that coupled with our faith makes a really strong presence and impact. Because I think I don't know if you said it, but when we know the gifts that God has given us and are comfortable with that and know who we are, I'm just imagining David, like, the dude knew how to throw a sling. I mean, he knew how to throw rocks with a sling, and just that coupled with faith, I think, makes a powerful thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to another part. So David, shows up with the sling, which is kind of unexpected. But the next section in my notes here is called David's Wardrobe Malfunction. And so that's a kind of fun throwback to that Super Bowl.
That one
Remember
Super
Justin
Bowl.
Timberlake and Janet Jackson? That was a weird thing, huh? And so David experiences his own little bit of a wardrobe malfunction in a sense, because he arrives on the battle scene not to fight a battle. He's delivering the lunches to his brother, and so he's not dressed to fight a giant. And so we get a little funny kind of exchange that happens in 1 Samuel 17. These couple verses 38 and 39 tell us of his wardrobe, if you will. So Lisa, you want to read these couple verses?
Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, I can't walk in these, for I'm not used to them. So David removed them.
Yeah.
Did you say sword?
Sword. I liked all the letters in that word.
Yes.
There you go. It's good. Well, this is always a part of like the videos I've watched about King David and and fighting Goliath, or not King David, young David and King Saul as he goes to fight Goliath. Is that Saul lets him put on his armor, and it's like so funny because it doesn't fit him. He's like the little guy in the big armor, and so what is really fascinating though, I mean, this is King Saul, who, one, it's nuts that he's going to let this kid fight the giant on their behalf when he's got all this whole army of people who are probably more likely. So there's something stirring even in Saul when he's in David's presence that makes him think like, oh yeah, this kid's good. And not only that, but then he gives him his armor. I mean, the king's armor, the best that he's got there, but little David, it doesn't fit, little David's too little, and so he has to take it off and go back to just his shepherd's clothes and his shepherd's weapon of a sling. And I think that is just a really kind of fascinating thing about this whole thing is that David's wearing armor too big for him, so he gets back to his shepherd's clothes, and that is what he goes to face the giant in. And all through the story, everyone is just bending to David's will. Like, everything's going David's way. Everything that Ken does. Like, he's just there to bring food, but he ends up fighting the giant. Saul gives him his armor. Saul, the whole people, they celebrate the victory. And so anyway, it's all this like leading towards, again, David's ascendancy. This is David growing in fame and growing into this role of ultimately being king. And so one connection I was thinking about with comics. We'll get out of the musical realm and go to comics for a second. So the latest Spider-Man movie, which I'm sure you've all seen, Into the Spider-Verse, it's actually animated. But in that movie, there's a new Spider-Man character, Miles Morales, a new kid. It's not Peter Parker anymore, because in that world, Peter Parker has died. So that Spider-Man has died. And now there's this new kid, Miles Morales, gets bit by a radioactive spider. And so he becomes a new Spider-Man. So he gets the Spider-Man powers. But there's this really fascinating scene that I think is so interesting in relation to this story, because he doesn't want everyone to know that he is Spider-Man, and so he needs a costume to hide his identity. And because this is a world that already had a Spider-Man, you can buy Spider-Man costumes. So he goes to the store, buys a Spider-Man costume, and if you know Marvel Comics movies, you know Stan Lee, the creator, like the kind of one of the main creators of Marvel, and the creator of Spider-Man in particular. He created that character. He always does cameos in the movie. And so that's his cameo. Stan Lee is the clerk selling this new Spider-Man, his costume. And Miles Morales, his new Spider-Man kid, he's like, oh, I don't know if this thing is going to fit. And Stan Lee has this just great line where he goes, it always fits, eventually. And I think it's kind of this profound thing for this kid, because for now, like, he's not ready to be Spider-Man. He's just a kid who'd learned that he can stick to the walls and ceiling, with his hands. And David isn't ready to be king yet. Like, that armor literally doesn't fit yet. He's got some growing to do, both physically apparently, but also just into that role. He's got some growing to do. And so he's not there yet. And so he doesn't pick up the sword in this story. He puts it down. But eventually it will fit. Eventually he becomes the king of kings in the history of the people of Israel, where he is the most well-known king. But that sword that he didn't wield in this first day ultimately becomes the story of his life. He puts that armor on and he never takes it off. It's a part of the, in a sense, kind of the curse on his house, is that the sword will not pass from the house of David because of some bad stuff he does a little later on. We'll get into that. And so ultimately, he wears that sword, and that's his way. It's a way of violence. And yet, then we get to the story of Jesus, where Jesus, the son of David, as he's often called, not literally a son of David, but of that lineage, and he is a king that rules very differently. He doesn't take up the sword. He doesn't even take up the sling of violence. And instead, even as Jesus is arrested, we hear this verse where in Matthew 26, verse 52, so Jesus is being arrested, and one of his disciples pulls out a sword, and Jesus said to him, put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. And so I wonder what you think about that phrase in relation to David and in relation to us. As we think about the story of David taking up the sword and of Jesus not taking up the sword, what does that phrase mean to us? All who take up the sword will perish by the sword.
I think that what you give, you get in return.
Yeah.
So when you're kind and generous and graceful to other people, you should get that back. But if you pick up that sword, then you have to expect that in kind.
Sure. Yeah. It's the saying, when you're pointing the finger at someone else, there's how many fingers pointing back at you? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be used either for good or for bad, right? I mean, because when what you're dealing out is kindness and love and grace, yeah, still some hardship comes your way, but more grace and love, it will be returned, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
One thing too, like as a parent, one of the things that I'm always trying to do is do better than my parents or my parents' parents. Like, we hope that my kids ultimately learn something a little bit different than I did. And we always have this sort of, instead of extending the sword and keeping the sword going, that we learn how to extend something else. And think about how does that change? How do our words and actions impact the next person?
Yeah.
Another buzz term I'm thinking about is breaking generational curses.
Yeah.
Which is what I grew up believing in the faith that I had, and that's important. But we aren't victim to that. We can do something about that. We can take that sword, put it down, and put something else in there. Yeah. For this statement, I think of Martin Luther King Jr. and
Yeah.
his work in nonviolent protests, and how he is an example of doing something significant in this world, but not using the sword to do it. It probably takes longer to do so,
Yeah.
but it's more effective, and I really do think about him when I hear that part of that passage.
Yeah, I mean that nonviolent resistance that's a long, hard battle itself. With John Lewis's passing, there's been so many tributes kind of paid to him, and retelling and rehearing that story of his life. I've heard some interesting reflections and tellings of it, and the truth is, nonviolent resistance is not nonviolent. It's violent. Like, that's the story of him being beaten on the bridge in Selma. That was a very violent thing. It's the not repaying violence with more violence. In nonviolent resistance, it's usually only one side that's nonviolent. The other is violent, and that's part of the power in it, is shining a light on what we know is not the way. That hate and violence is not the way that we want to all live. And so, I think that's what's really hard, is that there's violence in the world, and even in that nonviolence resistance movement, there was a lot of violence, and that's part of what the power was. To be nonviolent when someone's being violent to you, that is tough.
Right. Now, Jesus modeled that for us,
Well, there he is,
over and
right?
over again, and so did Martin Luther King Jr. David lived in a very violent world, and he picked up that sword and did not put it down.
That ultimately becomes his demise. I mean, generationally, his son, Rehoboam, at the end of this text, will ultimately be the one to make the choice of continuing the evil or moving it forward, changing the way it goes. And ultimately chooses the worst, and it destroys the kingdom of God. I mean, so there's this great challenge there of, we're called to something else, and yet we live into what we know if we're not careful. I'm thinking of this great Isaiah 2:4, this call to turn swords into plowshares.
Yeah.
That which is used for destruction ultimately becomes that which is used for creation. I mean, there's something calling us to that, and I think that becomes the challenge even in reading a text like this, where the next step is really this epic battle scene, so to speak.
Violence.
Right, it's
Right.
violent, and the non-sanitized Sunday school version is very, very violent.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
This story would have an R rating
Yep.
if it
Yeah.
was on in the movie theater.
Yeah. So Taylor, would you be willing to read 1 Samuel 17?
Absolutely. 1 Samuel 17, verses 45 through 49. But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground.
Before we get too far into this kind of unpacking that little bit of text, we want to invite you to hear kind of a new song to us, but "Fear is a Liar" is the name of it. It has these wonderful lyrics, and I just want to share just a little bit of it. And it's when he told you you're not good enough, when he told you you're not right, when he told you you're not strong enough to put up a good fight, and when he told you you're not worthy, when he told you you're not loved, when he told you you're not beautiful, that you'll never be enough, that fear is a liar. It'll take your breath, stop you in your steps. It'll rob your rest, steal your happiness. this sense of fear that must have come in that moment, David sort of overcomes. I mean, he runs into battle, and he runs into this moment of just overcoming what for most of us would stop us in our tracks. I think that's the important part of talking about our fear and our giants.
When he told you you're not good enough, when he told you you're not right, when he told you you're not strong enough to put up a good fight, when he told you you're not worthy, when he told you you're not loved, when he told you you're not beautiful, that you'll never be enough. Fear, he is a liar. He will take your breath, stop you in your steps. Fear, he is a liar. He will rob your rest, steal your happiness, cast your fear in the fire, 'cause fear, he is a liar. Let your fire fall and cast out all my fears. Let your fire fall, your love is all I fear. Let your fire fall and cast out all my fears. Let your fire fall, your love is all I fear. Fear, he is a liar. He will take your breath, stop you in your steps. Fear, he is a liar. He will rob your rest, steal your happiness, cast your fear in the fire, 'cause fear, he is a liar, 'cause fear, he is a liar.
So it's an awesome song, and I love that "fear is a liar" line. I absolutely love that phrase, that fear can be the thing that changes who we are. I mean, either we are overcome by it and unable to do what we're called to, or we step in. And so David dumps the armor that he's been given, and he does kind of this unique thing. He picks up a shepherd's staff, 5 stones, and he approaches the giant. David the shepherd, not the king or warrior or otherwise. I mean, there's something profound about who it is that ultimately takes the battle to the giant. And so the Goliath continues that tirade. He continues to kind of taunt David. And David says, "You come at me with sword and shield, but I'm going to come at you with the name of the Lord." I love that line of the confidence in knowing who God is, and that God is with us in the midst of this stuff. Think about how that fits into COVID, that God is with this community. There's just some powerful thing in that. And this is the R-rated version coming at us very quickly. David runs at Goliath, slings a stone, strikes him down, and then cuts off his head. I mean, this is not children's version, right? But then he takes his head and his sword and shield, and he takes it home with him to his tent. Why? We kind of got to wonder. What's
Creep.
right? Like, totally. Why would you do this? And then Saul actually wonders right at this point, and we wonder if this is Saul's kind of losing it or unsure. The guy who went to give David his armor forgets who David is. And he says, well, who is this guy? And ultimately, the answer comes that I am David, son of Jesse of Bethlehem. I mean, I love that connection to who his history is. And so David, ultimately, the story of David is elevated in the ranks. He has military success and group success. And Saul keeps giving him more and more power. And that kind of leads us into the end and a little bit of hint at next week's lesson, right?
Yeah, because so first this Sunday we're going to go more into the fear, because one of the big ironies is, yes, David conquers his fear and fights Goliath and conquers him, and then what happens next as his fame grows and he is given more power, ultimately that current king, Saul, who is giving him all that power and praise, realizes that David is becoming more popular than he is, and so that can't happen. That is no good. And so ultimately Saul will try to kill David, and David in fear will run. And so on Sunday we're going to talk a little bit about fear, and that fear, that fear of self-preservation, which is a good and healthy fear to have. But then those other fears that are, less life-giving and can be more, derailing us from what's important in life. And so I'm looking forward to that conversation for us to wrestle with that. And then next week we will go into the story of kind of David getting to be out on the run, because there's an interesting thing that grows out of Saul's disdain for David, and that is a really beautiful and surprising friendship between David and Saul's son Jonathan, which is this great kind of bromance friendship where they are just really good friends, and Jonathan will ultimately help him escape so that Saul can't kill David. And so that's kind of where we're going here into this next series, is to, in the next week ahead, is to on Sunday talk about fear and then get into friendship with David and Jonathan. So looking forward to having you come back and join us for those. But for today, we'll wrap up with a psalm. This is Psalm 13, and it's a psalm that I think fits really well with today. It is a psalm of David. And so we're reading it alongside of this story of the battle with the Philistines, with Goliath. But David had many battles, and so maybe he wrote this about that day he was fighting Goliath. Maybe he wrote it about one of his many other battles. Maybe it was an abstract enemy in battle. We don't ever know exactly the context, and so that's, I think, what makes it relatable to us, whatever the enemies and Goliaths that we're facing. So we'll close with this psalm, Psalm 13.
How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?
How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?
Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death.
And my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken.
But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation.
And I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me.
How long, O Lord, will you forgive me? How long, Lord, will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle